What happens when Hollywood's kindest man walks straight into the lion's den? Keanu Reeves knew the talk show host was ruthless, known for humiliating his guests on live TV. But instead of backing down, Keanu said yes, with one vow. What unfolded next left millions in silence and changed everything. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The air was still that morning. Keanu Reeves sat on the wooden steps of his porch, cradling a warm mug of coffee between his hands. It was the kind of quiet morning he'd grown to treasure. No alarms, no sets, no red carpets, just the sound of distant birds and the rustle of trees swaying gently in the breeze. For once, life didn't feel like a blur. His latest film, an emotionally charged action drama, had just opened to rave reviews. Critics called it his most powerful performance in years. Fans flooded theaters, some watching it twice in the same weekend. The internet was ablaze with praise, and his team was already talking about award campaigns. But Keanu had never cared much for that. What moved him most wasn't the applause. It was knowing the story had touched people. He had just returned from a short trip to Tokyo, where a fan had waited outside his hotel for hours just to hand him a sketch she'd made, him cradling a child in a burning building, a key scene from the film. Her eyes had welled up when he took it from her hands and said simply, "Thank you." That image stayed with him, a reminder of why he kept doing this. Now, with a few days of stillness before the next press wave, Keanu welcomed the silence like an old friend. He reached for his phone only to check the weather, but a new email sat unread at the top of his inbox. His assistant had forwarded it late the night before. The subject line was direct and plain. Invitation to the Victor Langston Show. Keanu stared at the name. It didn't surprise him. Whenever one of his movies blew up, talk shows lined up for a piece of the wave. But this one was different. Victor Langston. The name had become almost mythical in Hollywood circles. Host of the Victor Langston Show, one of the highest-rated late-night programs on television, Victor was known for his razor-sharp humor, but also his brutal takedowns of guests. He didn't interview, he dissected. Many celebrities went on his show once and never again. Keanu tapped the email open. "Dear Mr. Reeves, we would be honored to welcome you to the Victor Langston Show for a featured guest segment next week. The nation is buzzing about your new film, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in your own words. Please let us know your availability." There were no red flags in the wording. In fact, it was almost too polite. That's what made it feel off. It read like a form letter with silk gloves masking the steel claws underneath. Keanu set the phone down, exhaled slowly, and stared out over his garden. The invitation wasn't unexpected, but it wasn't easy either. He knew exactly what he'd be walking into. And yet, he wasn't sure if he wanted to walk away. Later that afternoon, Keanu met with his team at his home. His longtime agent, Tessa, sat across from him at the kitchen table, arms folded and eyes narrowed as she read the email again. She didn't hide her concern. "I'm just saying," she began, "there are better ways to promote the film than walking into Victor Langston's lion's den." Keanu gave her a half smile. "You think it's a trap." "I know it's a trap," she said, setting her phone down. "You've seen what he does to people. The jokes aren't just jokes, Keanu. He picks at scars, real ones. Last month, he made a pop star cry, on air." Another team member chimed in. "It could be good exposure if he plays nice." Keanu turned to the window, letting their voices drift behind him. Outside, the sunlight spilled over his backyard, dappled through branches that waved gently in the wind. He watched a squirrel dart across the fence and disappear into the hedges. He remembered an old friend once telling him, "Your strength is quiet, but it's real." He'd never forgotten that, and as strange as it sounded, he felt like this might be a moment to test it. He turned back to the table. "What if I go?" he said quietly. "What if I go and I don't play his game?" Tessa looked up sharply. Keanu? I won't lash out. I won't play the victim. But I won't back down either. He met her eyes. If he wants a spectacle, he won't get one. But maybe, just maybe, people will see there's another way. They all sat in silence. It wasn't a rejection of their concern. It was a choice. A calm one. Keanu had made peace with the risk. Fame had taught him long ago that staying silent wasn't always strength, but knowing when to speak and how, that mattered. Tessa sighed and leaned back in her chair. Then let's make sure you're not walking in there blind. Keanu nodded. I'm not. That night, alone again, Keanu sat on a stone bench in his garden. The stars had come out, glittering above the dark silhouettes of trees. The email was still fresh in his mind, but he wasn't thinking about the show. He was thinking about character, about what it meant to sit across from someone who might try to tear you down and not flinch. He pulled a folded note from his pocket. It was old, creased at the edges, written in faded black ink. A message from someone he had once trusted deeply. Hold your peace. It had been written in love, not as a warning, but as a choice. Keanu read the words, then slowly folded the paper again and slipped it back into his coat. He would go on the show, but he would go on his terms. Morning arrived with a stillness that carried weight. Keanu stood in his kitchen, pouring hot water over a mug of tea, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. He had sent his reply just after midnight, short and sincere. Thank you for the invitation. I'd be honored to join. He hadn't second-guessed it, not once. But beneath that peace was a readiness. He knew what Victor Langston was capable of. He'd heard the stories, watched a few clips. The show wasn't a conversation, it was a performance. The stage was Victor's kingdom, and guests were often cast as fools, punchlines, or cautionary tales. But what if someone refused to be any of those? That was the thought that kept coming back to Keanu. What if he didn't retaliate, didn't shut down, didn't flinch, but simply held steady? Would the audience notice? Would they feel something different? He wasn't seeking revenge. That wasn't his way. But he did believe in something bigger, that vulnerability didn't need to be a weapon, that you could disarm cruelty with integrity. Later that day, as he stepped out of his house and headed to a quiet lunch with a friend, his phone buzzed again. Text messages from people who had caught wind of the upcoming appearance. One said, "Langston's gonna try and break you. Don't let him." Another joked, "Can I send you a suit of armor?" He chuckled softly. The concern touched him more than the humor. At lunch, over quiet conversation, his friend leaned in and said, "You really think kindness can win against a guy like that?" Keanu paused, stirring his drink slowly before answering. "I think the world's seen enough shouting. I think it needs someone who stays grounded, even when others try to shake the earth under them." His friend didn't reply right away. Then finally, "Well, if anyone can do it, it's you." The rest of the day passed without noise. Keanu returned home, unplugged from the world, and reread the simple email once more. The words hadn't changed, but he had. Not because he wanted the spotlight, but because he believed that stepping into discomfort sometimes led to clarity. As evening fell, Keanu walked through his garden again, this time letting his hand trail gently across the tops of the flowers. He didn't feel nervous, not yet. What he felt was something else entirely. Resolve. Whatever waited on that stage, he would face it without pretense, without armor, just himself. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The day of the show arrived with a strange mix of anticipation and stillness. Keanu Reeves woke early, long before the sun crept across his window pane. He didn't touch his phone. He didn't scroll through social media or check the news. Instead, he moved through his morning ritual with quiet intention. Tea, meditation, a slow walk through the garden, He wanted to arrive centered, grounded, because the moment he stepped into that studio, he knew the atmosphere would be anything but calm. By late afternoon, his car pulled into the private lot behind the studio where the Victor Langston show was filmed. The building was plain from the outside, just another structure tucked between sound stages and city streets. But Keanu had walked into enough rooms over the years to feel when something was off before the first word was spoken. A studio assistant, no older than 22, greeted him nervously at the door. She wore a headset and carried a clipboard that looked too heavy for her small hands. Her smile wavered the moment she made eye contact with him. "Mr. Reeves," she said, voice barely audible, "we're so honored to have you." He returned her smile gently. "Thank you. And please, just Keanu." She nodded quickly and motioned for him to follow. The hallway was long and brightly lit, but somehow it still felt dim. Crew members passed by with armfuls of cables and lighting rigs, each wearing the same distracted expression. Eyes down, mouths tight, like they all knew something was coming and didn't want to be caught in the crossfire. As they reached the green room, the assistant hesitated before opening the door. "You'll be in here until your segment starts," she said. "Someone will come by to mic you up in about 30 minutes. Keanu glanced at her. She was fidgeting with the edge of her clipboard now. "Is everything okay?" he asked softly. She looked up, startled. Then, after a pause, she sighed. "I probably shouldn't say anything, but..." She lowered her voice. "Just be careful. Victor has a reputation. I mean, I know you've heard the stories, but what people don't realize is it's worse when the cameras are rolling." Keanu raised an eyebrow. Anton Bean looked at his wife Keith, who smiled wanly. "He goes anti-life." Anton Bean looked like he enjoys watching people squirm. Like he enjoys watching people squirm. Last month, a guest left in tears. One before that walked off stage. He always finds something. A moment to twist. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, creased piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a single sentence written in faded ink. "Hold your peace." The assistant saw it and blinked. "Is that a quote?" Keanu smiled quietly. "Something a friend once gave me." The assistant gave a small nod, as if unsure how to respond, then stepped back. "Well, I hope you won't need it," she said. "But if anyone can handle Victor, I think it's you." She left quickly, and Keanu was alone again. The green room was furnished like a hotel lobby. Plush armchairs, a few dim lamps, a tray of untouched fruit and bottled water on a side table. It was meant to feel comfortable, but the silence had a weight to it. It wasn't restful. It was waiting. Keanu sat down and placed the note on the table beside him. His fingers traced the edge of it absent-mindedly. "Hold your peace." Those words had carried him through more storms than he could count, not by making him passive, but by giving him a center to return to. He'd been through worse than this. He'd faced loss, ridicule, betrayal. But this moment wasn't about pain. It was about pressure. Victor Langston was the kind of man who weaponized discomfort. He created unease and turned it into entertainment. His stage wasn't a spotlight. It was a test. Keanu leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. He slowed his breathing. Counted to 4. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. Hold. Again. He didn't want to be reactive. He didn't want to let someone else control the emotional temperature of the room. If anything, he wanted to be the calmest person there. The one who didn't flinch, who didn't run, who didn't strike back. A knock came on the door. This time it was a crew member with a mic and a small receiver pack. "Hey, just here to get you wired up," the tech said, crouching down beside him. He seemed more relaxed than the assistant, but his eyes were tired. "Seen a lot of these shows?" Keanu asked lightly as the man clipped the mic to his collar. "Too many," the tech muttered, taping the cord down. "Just Try not to let it get under your skin, man. He's been itching for someone big to crack. You're his prize tonight." Keanu gave a quiet nod. "Thanks for the heads up." As the tech stood and left, Keanu sat forward and picked up the note again. It wasn't just a reminder. It was a promise to himself. Whatever happened out there, he would not lose who he was. A few minutes later, the assistant reappeared, now wearing a more serious expression. "They're ready for you," she said. Keanu stood. He tucked the note back into his jacket, adjusted his collar, and gave her a grateful nod. The hallway to the stage stretched before him like a tunnel. At the far end, the distant roar of the audience filtered through the thick studio doors. He walked toward it, slow, steady steps, not rushing, not hesitating. Whatever waited for him on the other side, he was ready to meet it. Just before reaching the final door, Keanu paused. A producer approached him with a wide, artificial grin and a headset snug behind his ears. "Keanu, great to have you. Victor's excited, real big numbers tonight. You're gonna love it." Keanu nodded politely. "Looking forward to it." The producer leaned in, his voice dropping. "Quick thing, just so you're aware, Victor might go a little off-screen. You know how he is. But don't worry, it's all part of the show. Nothing personal." Keanu didn't answer right away. He studied the man's expression. There was something behind the words. Not concern, not warning, just expectation. Like they were all waiting to see what he'd do when the fire got hot. The producer patted him on the back and stepped aside. The stagehand by the curtain gave a thumbs up. Keanu could hear the music swell as the band played the show's theme. The applause rolled in like thunder, and Victor's voice boomed from behind the wall. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, our next guest is someone you all know and love. He's the star of the hottest movie in America right now. Please welcome Keanu Reeves." The curtain parted. The light hit him instantly, bright, almost blinding, but he didn't blink. He stepped forward slowly, emerging onto the stage as the audience exploded into cheers. Some rose to their feet. Others shouted his name. The chant broke out from a few corners of the room. "You're breathtaking." He smiled, warmly, fully, without any trace of tension. He raised a hand in appreciation, then walked toward Victor Langston, who stood waiting behind his sleek desk with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. They shook hands. Victor leaned in and said something under his breath, just loud enough for Keanu to hear. "Let's see what you're really made of." Keanu didn't react. He simply nodded, took his seat, and folded his hands in his lap. As the music faded and the crowd quieted, Victor turned to the cameras with his signature smirk. "We've got a lot to talk about tonight," he said. Keanu sat still, breathing evenly, the soft pulse of the mic wire pressed against his chest. His jacket was buttoned neatly. Inside, the folded note rested against his heart. "Hold your peace." He could still feel the edges of it, sharp and comforting all at once. Across the desk, Victor Langston launched into his opening monologue, voice rich with charm, jokes flying effortlessly. But Keanu knew what this really was. It wasn't just an interview. It was a test, and he had already made his choice. He would pass it not by fighting back, not by raising his voice, but by standing still, unshaken. The applause hadn't stopped since Keanu stepped into the light. It rolled across the studio like a wave, loud and rising, filled with admiration that couldn't be faked. Keanu smiled softly, giving a small bow to the audience, then a nod to the band. His body moved with calm precision. No rush, no theatrics, just presence. He walked across the stage and extended his hand to Victor Langston, who stood waiting with a grin too practiced to be genuine. They shook, and Keanu held the contact just long enough to acknowledge it. Then he sat. Victor slid into his seat behind the desk, leaning back casually with a gleam in his eyes. He let the cheers continue for a few more seconds before raising a hand to quiet the crowd. "Well, well, well," Victor said. Look who's finally decided to grace our stage. Keanu chuckled softly. It's good to be here. You've got fans chanting your name in the streets, critics throwing awards at you, and somehow you still find time to show up to my humble corner of chaos. I gotta say, I'm flattered. I appreciate the invite, Keanu replied simply. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. So let's start with the obvious, he said. Your new film is blowing up. Big stunts, bigger emotions. What's it feel like to still be breaking box office records after all these years? Keanu nodded, thoughtful. It's humbling, he said. Every time a project connects with people, it reminds me why I keep doing this. It's never about chasing numbers. It's about stories and the hope they carry. The audience responded with gentle applause. Victor gave a mock gasp. Look at that. Mr. Reeves already too wholesome for this show. I was hoping for explosions and maybe a few tears, but you're giving me gratitude and wisdom. Where's the Hollywood diva I was promised? The crowd laughed, and so did Keanu. He leaned back in his chair, relaxed. You'll have to settle for quiet appreciation, he said. Victor smiled, but there was a tightness behind it now. He flipped through his note cards. Well, I guess that's just who you are. Zen monk by day, action hero by night. But I gotta ask, doesn't it get exhausting, being the nice guy all the time? Keanu's expression didn't change. I don't think of it as being nice, he said. I just try to treat people the way I want to be treated. That's all. Victor gave a small laugh. That's sweet. But this is Hollywood. Isn't that a bit old-fashioned? Keanu shrugged. Maybe. But I've seen what happens when kindness is missing. And I'd rather hold on to it. For a moment, the room went still. Victor looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. He had just thrown out his first hook, and Keanu had dodged it without blinking. Victor adjusted his cards again, tapping them on the desk as if stalling for time. The smile was still there, but now it twitched at the corners. He looked back up with a grin. Let's switch gears, he said. You've been in the business for what, 3 decades now? Keanu nodded. Just about. That's a long time to keep riding motorcycles, dodging bullets, and brooding in dark alleyways. Ever worry people might be getting tired of it? The laughter from the audience was scattered. Some found it funny. Others weren't sure. The tone had shifted again, a subtle tilt toward mockery. Keanu kept his posture open. I think if you love something and you give it everything, people can feel that. I don't worry about being tired of. I worry about being honest in the work. Victor raised his eyebrows. Oh, no fear of becoming a cliché? No existential dread that maybe the Matrix is starting to look a little pixelated? Another scattered laugh. Keanu smiled politely. Existential dread comes and goes, he said. But what never gets old is giving people a reason to feel something. This time, the audience clapped without hesitation. Victor leaned back in his chair, clearly annoyed that his playful jab hadn't landed. He crossed one leg over the other, eyes flickering as he looked for another angle. Okay, he said. Let's get real. You live this very quiet, private life. No scandals, no meltdowns. You even take the subway like a regular person. What's the deal? Are you hiding a secret identity? Keanu chuckled. No mask under here. Come on, Victor pushed. You've got to admit it's a little weird. Most actors your age are out partying or ranting on Twitter, and here you are, drinking tea, reading poetry, riding a motorcycle alone. You're not lonely? The question was framed like a joke, but it didn't land like one. There was a faint shift in the crowd. Not quite discomfort, but something close. Keanu's smile faded just slightly. Not from offense, but from thought. I don't think solitude is the same thing as loneliness, he said slowly. I think being alone can be a gift. It gives you space to reflect, to breathe, to find clarity. Victor tilted his head. Sounds poetic. Keanu nodded. Sometimes it is. Another quiet beat passed. Victor tried to laugh it off. Well, now I feel like I need to start meditating. The audience laughed along, easing the tension. Keanu smiled again, not defensive, not guarded. But underneath, there was something steadier now. Victor was testing the water, seeing where the cracks might be. And Keanu? He wasn't cracking. He was anchoring deeper. Victor flipped to another card, pretending to read it but barely glancing down. "Let's talk about the past," he said, his voice taking on a smoother, lower tone. "Your fans love your movies, but they also seem obsessed with this idea of sad Keanu. You've seen the memes, right? You on a bench, looking like the weight of the world's on your shoulders?" Keanu nodded. "I've seen them." Victor leaned forward slightly. "Is that just your resting face, or is there more truth in it than people realize?" The room went quiet. The audience laughed awkwardly, unsure how to react. Was this still a joke, or had the conversation just turned? Keanu sat still, breathing slowly. "There have been moments in my life that were heavy," he said, calm and honest. "But I don't think sadness defines a person. It's just one part of the picture." Victor didn't back down. "Come on, man. You've been through it. You've lost people, had your share of tragedy. Don't you ever feel like the universe owes you a break?" The silence in the room sharpened. Even the band, always quick with filler notes, held back. Keanu's eyes flicked briefly toward the crowd, then back to Victor. "I don't think the universe owes me anything," he said. "Life is life. Beautiful and hard, full of joy and pain. I try to focus on what I still have, not what I've lost." The words were simple, but they landed like stones dropped in still water. Victor shifted in his seat, clearly thrown. He tried to brush it off with another smirk. "Well, that's one way to look at it." Keanu nodded. "It's the only way that's helped me heal." A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't the interview they'd expected, but they weren't pulling away. They were leaning in. Victor cleared his throat. "Okay," he said, "let's keep it light." But the shift had already happened. The crowd had felt the edge in Victor's question, and they'd seen how Keanu handled it. With calm, truth, and no bitterness. The temperature in the room had changed. Victor had gone fishing for weakness, but what he found instead was strength. Not the loud, defiant kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't flinch when the past is brought up, the kind that looks back and still chooses to move forward. Victor glanced at his notes again, looking for something, anything, to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But the audience already knew. The tone had been set, and Keanu Reeves wasn't there to play a part. He was there to be himself, exactly as he was. Victor Langston shifted in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he set the next card aside without reading it. The air in the studio had shifted since Keanu's last response. The crowd had gone quiet, not out of boredom, but out of respect. They were listening, truly listening. And Victor didn't like it. With a sudden brightness in his voice, he leaned forward. "You know what I find fascinating, Keanu?" he said. "You've been doing this action thing for, almost 30 years now? And it's always the same formula. Guns, motorcycles, brooding silence. Rinse and repeat." There was a chuckle from one section of the audience, but most stayed quiet. The tone felt sharper now, less playful, more deliberate. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "I'd say it's a little more than that." Victor waved a hand dramatically. Sure, there's a heartfelt speech here, a sacrifice there. But don't you think it's getting a bit tired? I mean, how many more times can John Wick avenge something?" This time, the laugh was louder. Victor smirked, sensing a win. But Keanu remained perfectly still. "Whether you love what you do," he said, "age doesn't matter. Heart does." A wave of applause broke out. Not a roaring standing ovation, but enough to disrupt Victor's momentum. Victor smiled tightly. "Art, right. But you're, nearing 60? Keanu nodded. I am. Don't you ever think, maybe it's time to hang it up, let the new guys take the reins? Keanu let the silence sit before responding. I've never looked at it as competition. I'm not trying to outlast anyone. I just want to tell stories that matter to me, and if people still show up to watch, then maybe there's still something I can give. Victor leaned back, clearly agitated that his digs weren't landing the way he intended. Sure, but let's be honest. You're not exactly pushing boundaries anymore. You're playing the same guy in different jackets. A quiet gasp passed through the crowd. It was a jab, and not a light one. Keanu didn't flinch. If I can still inspire someone, he said gently, then I haven't lost my place. Another round of applause followed, this one longer. People weren't clapping for a comeback line. They were clapping for a man who refused to be baited. Victor glanced at the cameras, then at his producer off stage. He was trying to regain control, but the momentum was slipping. The more Keanu stayed calm, the more the audience seemed to turn toward him and away from Victor. He pressed on, but there was now a flicker of something new in his expression. Frustration, and maybe even a trace of doubt. Victor folded his hands on the desk, forcing a chuckle as though trying to mask the tension. But everyone in the studio could feel it. Something had shifted. He cleared his throat, pretending to reset. You know, Keanu, he said, a lot of actors your age are moving into producing or teaching, taking a back seat, letting the spotlight move on. But not you. You're still out there, punching bad guys and dodging bullets like it's 1999. He laughed, waiting for the audience to join in. A few did, out of habit more than amusement. Keanu leaned slightly forward. Every role I take, I ask myself if I can still bring something real to it. Something honest. If the answer is yes, then I go all in. If the answer is no, I walk away. Victor raised an eyebrow. So you've never taken a paycheck gig? Keanu smiled faintly. I've made mistakes like anyone, but I've tried to learn from them. Growth isn't always in the spotlight. Victor tried again. Let's play a little game. If I showed a random person on the street 5 of your action movies back to back, you think they could tell them apart? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Keanu didn't blink. Maybe not, but maybe they'd feel something. Maybe one moment would land. Maybe a line, a scene, a look. That's all I care about. The room was still. Victor chuckled again, but this time it was tighter, thinner. He was slipping, and everyone could feel it. The audience wasn't laughing with him anymore. They were watching Keanu. Closely, intently. Okay, Victor said, tapping his fingers on the desk. Let's say you've still got a few hits left in you, but don't you worry about fading out, becoming that guy people talk about in past tense, like, hey, remember Keanu? He was cool once. There was a noticeable shift in the crowd. The temperature had dropped. Keanu didn't move. He just nodded slowly. I think about legacy, he said, but not in the way most people mean it. I don't care if people remember me for fame. I care if something I did helped someone. That's the kind of legacy worth leaving. The audience clapped again, louder this time. A few stood. Victor glanced around, trying to stay composed. Wow, he said, forcing a grin. You really know how to make a guy look bad, huh? Keanu just smiled again. Not smug, not triumphant, just steady. I'm not here to make anyone look bad, he said. I'm just here to be real. And that, more than anything, was the problem for Victor. Keanu wasn't fighting back. He was winning by not needing to. Victor leaned forward now, abandoning the cards altogether. His voice dropped just enough to signal the change. Let's cut through it, Keanu. You're the internet's favorite nice guy. You give up your seat on the subway, you donate your salary, you're polite to every interviewer. But isn't that exhausting? Doesn't it get old, always having to be the good guy? The question hit with weight, not because it was bold, but because it was designed to undermine everything Keanu stood for. The room went silent again. Keanu didn't rush to answer. He sat with the question, letting it breathe. Then, finally, with the same calm he'd carried all evening, he said, "Being kind isn't a performance. It's a choice. Some days it's easy, some days it's hard, but it's always worth it." A pause. And no, it doesn't get old. What gets old is pretending you have to be someone else just to fit into someone else's idea of who you should be. The audience broke into applause again, but this time it wasn't just polite. It was emphatic. A few people whistled. Others rose to their feet. Victor leaned back, visibly rattled now. He picked up a pen from the desk and clicked it once, twice, before setting it down again. "You don't even flinch," he muttered, mostly to himself. Keanu glanced at him. "There's nothing to flinch at." Victor blinked. "You don't get mad? Not even a little?" "I get mad," Keanu said. "But not here, not now. This isn't about me. It's about what people watching take away, and I'd rather they take away peace than pride." The words echoed. Even those watching from home would later say they felt something shift in that moment. Like they weren't just seeing a celebrity speak. They were seeing a man decide, in real time, not to meet fire with fire. Victor gave a small laugh, clearly unsure what else to do. "Well, Keanu, I gotta say, you're one tough nut to crack." Keanu nodded once. "I'm not trying to be tough. I'm just trying to be clear." Another murmur rippled through the audience. Victor looked down at his desk, flipping over one last card as if it might save him. But the card was blank. His script was gone. His momentum was gone. And Keanu? He was still there, still breathing evenly, still kind, still holding his peace. The first jab had been thrown, but it hadn't landed. And for the first time that night, Victor Langston looked unsure of what to do next. The audience, however, knew exactly where their hearts were leaning. And the stage? The stage was starting to belong to someone else. Victor Langston was floundering. He had tried the light teasing, the professional jabs, even subtle digs about relevance and age. None of it had worked. Keanu Reeves had met every curveball with grace, not deflection, and the audience wasn't laughing at the host's wit anymore. They were watching Keanu, not out of amusement, but admiration. Victor leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he tapped his pen against the desk. He glanced toward the side stage, where a producer gave him a look that read, "Do something." He exhaled and leaned forward again, a smile slowly spreading across his face. "All right," Victor said, his voice smoother now. "Let's talk about something a little deeper, shall we?" Keanu nodded once, calm and composed. "Sure. You've been through a lot, Keanu," Victor continued. "I mean, more than most. Personal loss, family stuff, tragedy. You're kind of the poster child for Hollywood pain." The audience stiffened. Victor went on, his tone still light, but his words cutting. "People joke about it. You've seen the memes, right? Sad Keanu, sitting alone on a bench with a sandwich, head down, brooding. Honestly, I always wondered, was that just a bad day, or are those photos more honest than the movies?" A gasp rose from the audience. It was quick, involuntary. Some shifted in their seats. A few murmured. One woman in the front row covered her mouth. Keanu didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't tighten his jaw or look away. He waited, let the silence sit for a moment. Then he spoke. "Grief isn't weakness," Keanu said quietly. "It's proof of love." The words hit the studio like a pin dropping in a cathedral. Even the camera crew stopped moving. Keanu's voice didn't rise. He didn't challenge. He just kept speaking, slow and steady. "I've lost people I loved. My daughter. Others. It doesn't go away. It stays with you. Not to haunt you, but to remind you that what you had was real." Victor tried to chuckle, tried to soften what had suddenly become an uncomfortably human moment. "Well, sure, but it's just a meme. People use it to connect, you know? It's not meant to be cruel. Keanu looked out at the audience, then back at Victor. I don't mind the photo, he said. It doesn't bother me. But the idea that sadness is something to mock, that's where we get it wrong. A few members of the audience began clapping, slowly at first, then more joined. It wasn't explosive, it was reverent, respectful. One man stood near the back, then a second near the front row. Victor's mouth opened slightly. He hadn't expected this. Keanu had just shifted the entire energy of the room, not by winning a debate, but by honoring the very pain Victor tried to exploit. Victor cleared his throat. The cards on his desk were useless now. He hadn't looked at them in minutes. His hands fidgeted near the edges of his desk, unsure whether to press forward or change the subject. He tried to smile again, but it came out thinner than before. All right, he said, let's not get too heavy here. It's a late-night show after all. Keanu didn't look away. Sometimes what's heavy is what people remember. Victor blinked. I think people carry more than we realize, Keanu said. We pretend everyone's okay, that grief is something to hide or get over. But we never really get over it. We carry it differently. We learn how to live around it. He paused. And sometimes someone sees a photo of a man on a bench and thinks, that's how I feel too. If that helps them feel less alone, then I'm grateful. Victor opened his mouth to interject, but there was nothing he could say. The words had landed. The audience was hanging on every syllable. Keanu wasn't using the stage to promote a movie. He was using it to tell the truth. Victor tried to pivot. Oh, do you think all that pain is what makes you good at these tortured characters, the quiet loner types? Or are you just always in character off-screen? A few people in the audience groaned. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The mood was slipping from his hands completely. Keanu shook his head gently. I don't act to escape pain. I act to explore truth, and sometimes the truth is painful. But that doesn't mean I live there. Victor forced a laugh. So what? You're just naturally tragic? Keanu's eyes didn't flinch. I'm naturally human. There it was again. The kind of answer that disarmed, not because it struck back, but because it refused to lower itself. Keanu wasn't pushing back. He was pulling something forward. Victor glanced at the audience. Faces that once looked amused now looked reflective. Some were leaning forward, elbows on knees. A few had their hands clasped near their mouths. Keanu took a breath and added, I think we all carry things that don't show on the surface. It's why I try to be kind, because I never know what someone else is holding inside. Applause broke out again, stronger, more certain. Victor tapped a pen against his desk, then set it down without looking at it. He had taken the shot, a personal one, a deep one, and not only had it failed to shake Keanu, it had made him stronger in the room. For the first time all night, Victor looked small, and Keanu looked more present than ever. Victor sat still for a moment longer, as if waiting for a cue that never came. The camera lights burned above. The band hadn't played in several minutes. Even the cue cards on his desk now seemed irrelevant. He exhaled through his nose, then shifted in his seat, trying to find his footing again. So, he said, softer now, you think your losses made you more empathetic? Keanu considered the question, then nodded slowly. Yes, they did. And that's something you carry into your work? I carry it into my life. Another beat of silence passed before Keanu continued. When you lose someone you love, it changes how you look at every person, every stranger. You realize just how fragile we all are, how quickly things can disappear. It makes you cherish moments more, and it makes you careful with your words. Victor swallowed hard. His next words came out quieter. I didn't mean to. Keanu gently raised a hand. You don't need to apologize. I know you have a job to do, And I know you ask the questions you think people want answered, but I think sometimes what people really want is honesty, not spectacle, not sound bites, just something true. The audience erupted. This time it was a full standing ovation, no hesitation. Dozens rose to their feet, clapping with such intensity that Victor had to wait before he could speak again. The show wasn't even over, but the audience had decided who they were there for. Keanu didn't rise. He simply nodded to the crowd, his eyes soft, his posture calm. There was no pride in his face, no victory, just a quiet, enduring presence. Victor finally leaned forward and spoke again, but the edge in his voice was gone. "I'll be honest, Keanu," he said. "I didn't expect this." Keanu looked at him. "What did you expect?" Victor hesitated. "I thought you'd deflect, joke, maybe even walk off. But you didn't." Keanu shrugged slightly. "There's nothing to run from. Grief taught me that. You can't outrun pain, but you can walk through it with your head held high." The crowd erupted once more, and a few audience members near the front wiped their eyes. Victor sat back again, letting out a slow breath. "I don't know what I thought this interview would be," he said, "but it's definitely not the one I planned." Keanu offered him a small, understanding smile. Maybe that's a good thing. And it was, because in trying to expose him, Victor had ended up revealing something far more powerful. Keanu's truth. Unshakable, unpretentious, unafraid. The studio fell quiet again, not in discomfort, but reverence. And through it all, Keanu never once raised his voice. He didn't need to. He had already said more than enough. Victor Langston sat forward now, hands clasped tightly together on the desk, his jaw stiff behind a smile that was quickly becoming harder to maintain. He had tried humor, he had tried condescension, he had even reached for personal pain, but Keanu Reeves had remained grounded, calm, present. The audience had turned. Their loyalty had shifted, and they weren't shy about it. Victor's pride wouldn't let him stop. He cleared his throat and leaned in slightly. "You know," he said, "this whole calm, gentle, unshakable persona, it's impressive, Keanu. Really. But let me ask you something honestly." Keanu looked at him, inviting the question with a quiet nod. "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" A murmur swept through the crowd. Victor continued, his voice dipped in sarcasm. "I mean, come on. Nobody is this good all the time. Kind, generous, selfless, wise. You ride the subway, you give to charity, you're polite in every interview. At some point, doesn't it just become branding?" Keanu stayed still. Victor pushed further. "Isn't this just a carefully curated image, the humble star, the guy who never gets angry, never snaps back, never takes the low road? You're telling me that's real, every second of every day?" The audience was stone silent now. No laughter, no applause, just silence. Keanu sat for a moment, then slowly turned his head and looked directly at Victor. His eyes were steady. Not hard, not cold, just still and clear. "Kindness," Keanu said, "isn't a tactic. It's how I survive." Victor blinked, caught off guard. Keanu went on, his voice soft but firm. "I've seen what anger does when it runs wild. I've watched cruelty eat people alive from the inside. I've lived through moments where the only thing I had control over was how I treated others. And I decided a long time ago I'd rather be kind and misunderstood than cruel and applauded." The audience stirred. Keanu continued, "You think kindness is a brand? It's not. It's a choice I make every day. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. But it's never about performance. It's about peace. And I hold on to it because I've seen what happens when people let it go." A single clap broke the silence. Then another. Then dozens more, building into a wave. Victor tried to speak, but the noise grew louder. The audience was no longer just watching, they were responding, visibly, emotionally, vocally. This wasn't a scripted moment. It was something real, something alive. Keanu waited for the applause to quiet, then spoke again, eyes still fixed on Victor. "Would you like to hear why I know it matters?" Victor didn't answer. He just nodded slowly. Keanu leaned back in his chair and folded his hands in his lap. And then he began to tell a story. "There was a fan," Keanu began, "maybe 15 years ago now. I never met her in person. I never got her name, but her brother reached out through my agent." He paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "He was in the hospital, terminal illness, young, maybe 17. He said she watched one of my films every day. Not for the story, not even for the action, just for the feeling it gave her. He told me that when she watched, she felt brave. The studio was still. I didn't know what to do. I'm not a doctor. I couldn't change her diagnosis. But I asked him if I could send her something. He said, sure." Keanu looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up. "So? I sent her a letter. A personal one. I didn't talk about her illness. I didn't try to comfort her. I just thanked her. I thanked her for watching, for feeling something, for teaching me, in a way, that what we do can matter." He paused again. "You passed away a few weeks later. I never told anyone about that. Until now." A hush blanketed the room. Keanu exhaled slowly. "There's a part of me that still writes letters in my head to people I'll never meet. People who are hurting. People who feel invisible. Because I've been those things. I still feel those things. And if being kind means I reach one of them, then I'll keep doing it, even if some people think it's just an act." Applause erupted again, this time louder than before. Some of the crew members backstage had tears in their eyes. One woman in the third row reached for a tissue. The energy in the studio had shifted entirely. It was no longer about entertainment. It was about truth. Victor tried to speak, but stumbled over his words. "Okay, but..." Keanu raised a hand gently, not to interrupt, but to soften the air. "I'm not here to prove anything to you, Victor. You don't have to believe me. That's okay. I'm not angry. I don't think the world needs more performances. I think it needs more sincerity." Victor opened his mouth again, but closed it. He reached for his water, took a sip, and set it back down without looking at the glass. "You really believe that?" he finally asked. Keanu nodded. "With everything I've got." The audience clapped again. Victor sat back in his chair. He looked at Keanu like he was seeing him for the first time. Like something had cracked. Not in Keanu, but in the wall Victor had built around himself. For the first time, Victor didn't have a comeback. And Keanu didn't need one. Victor exhaled and looked down at the desk, his voice quieter now. "I guess I underestimated you." Keanu smiled. "It happens." There was a pause, long enough to be noticed but not uncomfortable. It felt like something unspoken was hanging between them, something neither one was quite ready to name. Victor looked back up. "I've had people come on this show and tell all kinds of stories. Most of them come here to be liked or to sell something. But this..." He gestured vaguely at the space between them. "This is different." Keanu didn't say anything. He just waited. Victor continued. "People are going to replay that story, the one about the girl. They're going to talk about it online, write articles, call you a hero." "I'm not a hero," Keanu replied. "I'm a man who's made mistakes, who's had to learn the hard way, who's still learning." Victor tilted his head. "But don't you get tired of always carrying that weight? The sadness, the expectations, the pressure to be everyone's idea of the good one?" Keanu's eyes softened. "I don't carry it alone. That's the difference." He let the words sink in. "I have people who remind me who I am, who ground me, and when I forget why I started, I think about letters like that one. I think about people I've lost, and I ask myself, What would they be proud of? There were no cue cards left, no rehearsed jokes, no applause signs needed. The audience was fully present, drawn into a kind of stillness that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with reverence. Victor leaned back, rubbing his chin. "You know, I think I've been doing this job wrong." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Why do you say that?" "Because I've been looking for cracks in people, trying to find the flaws that make good television. But maybe the real story is in the ones who hold themselves together, even when it's hard." Keanu nodded. "Everyone has cracks, but some use them to let the light through." Another wave of applause swept the room. This time it didn't fade quickly. It rolled on, long and sustained, until Victor finally held up his hand. All right. You win, Reeves." Keanu smiled again, this time with a little more warmth. It was never a competition. Victor looked down at his desk, then back up again. "No, I guess not." He glanced toward the camera, then to the producer at the edge of the set. For once, he seemed uncertain about how to move forward. And Keanu? He simply sat there, still and composed. He had spoken his truth, shared his story, delivered his quiet counterpunch. Not with force, but with something far stronger. Conviction. The mood in the studio had shifted. What had started as a typical late-night interview had evolved into something else entirely. The audience wasn't laughing on cue anymore. They weren't just reacting. They were feeling, listening, engaged in a way most television audiences rarely were. Keanu Reeves had spoken with sincerity, and the audience had followed him there into silence, into depth, into truth. And Victor Langston, for the first time in a long time, had been knocked off script. Victor's shoulders were tense now. His jokes weren't landing. His rhythm was gone. He glanced off stage again, perhaps hoping for some visual cue from his producer, but none came. He was on his own. So he tried something else. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk with a false sense of ease. His voice lowered, as if he were about to let the audience in on a secret. "You know, Keanu," he said, "we've talked a lot about your tragedies, your grief, your calm philosophy. But there's one story I've always wondered about." Keanu tilted his head slightly. He didn't speak. Victor smiled thinly. "Your mom, she's the one who raised you, right? Strong woman, costume designer, moved you from country to country when you were a kid." Keanu nodded once. "That's right." Victor kept going. "I mean, to raise a kid like you, she must have been pretty patient. Or maybe she just taught you how to keep a straight face while everything fell apart." A few people in the audience reacted audibly. Someone in the back murmured, "Whoa." Others shifted in their seats. It wasn't a laugh line. It was a line meant to test the edge of the room. Victor leaned back, pleased with himself. Keanu said nothing. 5 seconds passed. Then 6. Then 7. He sat still, his face calm but unmistakably serious now. The quiet in the room deepened. The crew stopped moving. The camera zoomed in just slightly. Everyone, whether in the room or watching at home, felt it. Victor looked around, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Then, finally, Keanu spoke. "You can make jokes about me," he said, voice low and even. "But I ask you to leave the people I love out of it." The moment held like thunder right before the rain. There was no need to raise his voice. No need to explain further. He had drawn a line, firm, clear, and unmistakable. And the audience felt it. They erupted. Not just applause this time, but cheering. Loud. Unified. Standing. It wasn't about defending Keanu as a celebrity. It was about defending something deeper. A principle. A boundary. Victor sat frozen behind his desk. His smirk faded completely. He had crossed a line, and the crowd knew it. Victor tried to recover. He forced a small laugh, held up his hands as if to say he didn't mean anything by it, but the moment had already passed him. The audience didn't laugh with him. Instead, their faces stayed locked on Keanu, still standing in the aftermath of his soft but absolute response. Keanu hadn't scolded. He hadn't threatened. He had simply drawn a boundary. And he'd done it without anger. Victor cleared his throat. "Hey, I'm just saying, parents shape who we are, right?" Keanu nodded, but there was no smile this time. "That's true. And mine shaped me to respect people, especially the ones who aren't here to speak for themselves." The audience erupted again, louder now. The applause was no longer about the interview. It was about the energy. The balance had tipped. The host had been dethroned by his own arrogance, and in his place stood a man who hadn't lifted a finger, but had lifted the room. Victor looked stunned. He reached for a mug on his desk and took a slow sip of water, but the tremor in his hand betrayed him. Keanu turned slightly in his chair, facing the crowd more than the host now. "I think sometimes we forget," he said, "that when you speak about someone's mother, someone's sister, someone's child, you're not just reaching for a punchline. You're reaching into a life, a real one." He paused. People carry those lives with them, every day. So when you use them as props, it says more about you than them. Another round of applause. This time there were whistles, shouts. Someone yelled from the audience, "Respect!" Victor put down his mug and gave a weak smile. "Well, I guess I hit a nerve." Keanu turned back to him slowly. "You didn't hit a nerve. You revealed something." Victor tilted his head. "What's that?" "That cruelty always looks clever until it's standing next to dignity." The room exploded. Now the cameras had nowhere else to go but Keanu. The director in the control booth gave up on trying to balance the shot. Every monitor showed Keanu's face, calm and composed, while Victor stared ahead, lips slightly parted, his usual poise shaken. The crowd stood again, longer this time. Victor sat in that sound, shrinking. And Keanu? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't deliver a speech. He let the moment do the speaking. And it spoke volumes. Backstage, a production assistant whispered, "This is going to go viral in seconds." Another muttered, "He's not just winning the room, he's rewriting the rules." Still seated, Keanu simply nodded to the crowd. It wasn't about triumph. It was about truth. And everyone in the studio knew it. Victor rubbed the back of his neck. His posture had changed. His voice, once booming and dominant, was now hesitant, almost quiet. "Keanu," he began, I didn't mean it like that. It was a joke. That's all." Keanu looked at him evenly. Some things aren't jokes. The words weren't accusatory. They weren't sharp, but they had weight. The audience responded not with noise this time, but with stillness. A kind of reverent quiet. They knew they were witnessing something raw and real. Victor tried to push forward. "You have to admit, people expect late night to be edgy, unfiltered. That's what they tune in for." Keanu didn't look away. "You can be funny without being cruel. You can challenge someone without trying to cut them open." Victor looked down. "Maybe I forgot that." "You didn't forget," Keanu said gently. "You chose to ignore it. But now, you don't have to." That landed harder than anything else. Not because it was a reprimand, but because it was an invitation. The audience felt it. Some even nodded, as if the lesson was for more than just the man behind the desk. Victor swallowed hard. "I guess I'm not used to being called out without being yelled at." "I'm not here to yell," Keanu replied. "I'm here to hold a mirror." Victor didn't speak. Keanu continued, softly, "We all get to decide what kind of energy we bring into a room. You chose yours tonight, I chose mine, and now everyone gets to see the difference." That was it. The final shift. Whatever power Victor had held as host, it was gone. Not stripped from him, but surrendered, exposed by contrast. Keanu hadn't taken anything. He had simply stood in who he was. And in doing so, he had reminded the audience, reminded everyone watching, what real strength looks like. It's not loud. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't tear others down to raise itself up. Real strength draws a line, not with violence, not with vengeance, but with grace. Victor sat back in his chair, his shoulders slumped slightly. The fire behind his eyes was dim. Keanu glanced toward the audience once more, his tone gentle but unwavering. My mother is a good woman. She sacrificed a lot for me. She believed in me before anyone else did. And she deserves more than to be turned into a joke. Everyone's mother does. The audience stood again. No one told them to. They just rose, united, applauding the moment, the message, the man. Victor looked around, stunned by the power of what had just happened. The turning point wasn't loud. It wasn't a dramatic outburst. It was a man saying, "Enough," and meaning it. The applause still echoed through the studio as Victor Langston forced a smile, though his confidence had visibly cracked. Keanu Reeves sat calmly in his chair, not gloating, not reacting, simply grounded in the same composure he'd carried from the start. But what neither of them could see, at least not fully, was what had begun happening outside those studio walls. In living rooms across America, people were frozen, their remote controls forgotten, conversations paused. The interview had shifted from background noise to something people were now leaning toward. Phones lit up across couches and kitchens, recording clips, snapping screenshots, uploading moments with breathless captions. By the time Keanu finished speaking about his mother, the first video clip was already circulating on social media. A 10-second clip, posted by a college student watching from her dorm room, showed Keanu's line, "You can make jokes about me, but I ask you to leave the people I love out of it." She captioned it, "Strength, grace, boundaries. This is how it's done." Then added, "We stand with Keanu." Within minutes, her post was retweeted by a verified journalist, then a celebrity, then dozens more, across platforms. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, even YouTube. Clips spread like sparks across dry grass. Hashtags began trending in real time. Kindness is strength. Respect Keanu. We stand with Keanu. Picked across the line. In a matter of 20 minutes, the hashtags reached over 1 million impressions. Comments flooded in. "I was just watching for fun. Now I'm crying. This isn't an interview, this is a masterclass in self-respect. I didn't expect to feel something tonight, but Keanu made me feel everything." Hell didn't humiliate Victor. He held a mirror. And that's more powerful. Backstage at the studio, chaos was brewing. The producers leaned over their monitors, watching live feeds not only from the show but from online tracking software. One of them, a veteran with decades in the business, muttered under her breath, "This is bigger than the show." Another stared at a screen full of real-time comments and added, "We've lost the narrative." The show's social media manager, phone in hand, whispered to no one in particular, "We're trending worldwide, not because of Victor, because of Keanu." Meanwhile, back on stage, Victor was trying to recover. He adjusted his mic. He laughed softly, nervously, then said, all right, folks. Deep stuff tonight. Maybe we shift gears before we all break into tears." Keanu gave a polite nod, not indulging the discomfort, but also not mocking it. He let Victor try to redirect. But the energy had already changed. The viewers knew it, the studio knew it, Victor himself knew it. The show was still on, but it no longer belonged to him. In a control booth above the stage, one of the assistant producers stared at the numbers rolling in. "We just broke our highest engagement since the show began," she whispered. The executive producer, seated next to her, didn't look away from the screen. "He's not playing the game," she said. "He's changing it." Another staff member spoke into a headset, giving quiet orders to camera operators. "Stay tight on Keanu. every reaction, every word. He's the moment. Back on stage, Victor tried to reframe the conversation. "So," he said, trying for levity, "what's next for you, Keanu? Another big blockbuster? More quiet subway rides and giving up your seat to strangers?" There were a few chuckles, but most of the audience didn't laugh. Keanu took the question without flinching. "I'm working on a few things," he said. "A new film that focuses on second chances, a story about redemption." Victor forced a smile. "That seems on brand." Keanu met his eyes, but there was no tension in the look, just clarity. "It's not about branding, it's about healing. I think people are hungry for stories that don't mock their pain, but help them walk through it." The audience clapped again, but backstage, what caught everyone's attention was what happened online. A TikTok user had just posted a mashup the moment Keanu calmly set a boundary about his mother, followed by a text overlay that read, "You don't have to shout to be heard." It had been up for 6 minutes and already had over 200,000 likes. Underneath it, people commented things like, "I needed to hear this tonight. I'm showing this clip to my teenage son. Keanu just reminded me how to stand my ground without losing my peace." Victor looks like a man who brought a sword to a meditation session. Meanwhile, back in the studio, Victor continued to spiral beneath his surface smile. He looked out at the audience, now watching him with far more skepticism than before. Every sarcastic line fell flat. Every attempt to joke away the tension only highlighted his desperation. He adjusted his cuff, leaned into the microphone, and tried once more. "Well, Keanu, I gotta say, you're surprisingly good at these high-pressure moments. Ever thought about running for office?" The audience didn't laugh. Keanu gave a small, tired smile. "I don't want to lead with power, I'd rather lead with presence." The crowd roared. Even Victor, realizing what had just happened, lowered his head for a second, then looked up and muttered into his mic, "Man, I walked right into that." The moment was already being clipped by fans online. The comment sections filled with praise. "Held leads with presence." I'm writing that down. This is how we heal a culture obsessed with cruelty. I used to admire Victor. Now I understand why Keanu is timeless. By now, the staff monitoring the show's digital footprint were stunned. A junior editor shouted across the room, "The YouTube channel just doubled its subscriber count in 30 minutes. Another whispered, "The networks are going to want to rerun this. They're already asking for extended cuts." And yet, in the center of the storm, Keanu hadn't changed. He was still seated calmly in the same chair, hands resting lightly in his lap, responding to each question with care, each glance with intention. Victor Langston looked over his desk and gave a weak laugh. "Well, this has certainly been one for the books." Keanu nodded. "Every conversation has the chance to become something more than it started." Victor shook his head slowly. "And here I thought I was going to make you squirm." "You tried," Keanu said gently. "But I've sat with harder things than questions." The audience responded with soft laughter. This time warm, respectful, human. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked toward the side of the stage where his producer stood behind a camera, arms folded tightly, gaze unreadable. He had lost the show, but Keanu hadn't taken it from him. The audience had given it to Keanu. And online, the world was still watching. On Twitter, the clip of Keanu drawing the line about his mother had now reached 5 million views. Celebrities began chiming in. One posted, "This man just changed the standard for every late-night guest going forward." Another wrote, "We don't deserve Keanu Reeves, but thank God he keeps showing up anyway." Even a political figure retweeted the clip with the words, "This is leadership." On Facebook, the comments told a different story. More personal, more emotional. One post read, "I was watching this interview while folding laundry. Then he said that about grief not being weakness. And I just broke down. My husband passed away last year. I needed that reminder. Thank you, Keanu." Another wrote, I used to think standing up for yourself meant yelling. This man just taught me otherwise." Inside the studio, Victor looked at his guest and exhaled deeply. "I gotta be honest," he said. "I came into tonight thinking I was the one in charge, but it feels like maybe I was the student." Keanu smiled again, this time with warmth that filled the space. "We're all students, every day." A final burst of applause rang out. This time, no one stood because they were instructed. They stood because they couldn't help it. The live feed continued. The world kept watching. The views kept climbing. But Keanu Reeves didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight for attention. He just stayed present. And in doing so, he created a moment that would ripple far beyond the studio walls. Victor Langston sat with his elbows on the desk, hands tented beneath his chin, eyes studying the man across from him. His voice had grown quieter, more deliberate, like someone picking their way through a minefield with the knowledge they had already set off too many explosions. But there was still one more attempt left in him, a final swing. Not out of malice now, but desperation. "So," he said slowly, "all this," he gestured vaguely, "the kindness, the stillness, the calm responses, the generosity, don't you ever get tired of pretending you're perfect?" The words fell flat against the walls of the studio, not because they weren't loud enough, but because the air had changed. The audience didn't gasp. They didn't react. They waited. Keanu Reeves didn't flinch. He didn't laugh. He didn't counter. He just sat there, breathing in once, slowly, deeply. Then he exhaled and spoke softly. "I'm not perfect," he said. "I'm human." He let the words hang in the air for a second before continuing. "That's why I choose to be kind." There was something in his tone, not defensiveness, not humility, but truth. He didn't say it to win. He said it to close the door gently on the question itself. Victor looked down, mouth parted as if preparing another follow-up, but no words came. Keanu adjusted in his chair and looked out at the audience. Not to perform, but to connect. "I make mistakes," he continued. "I've hurt people, missed opportunities, failed to speak up when I should have. I've been angry. I've been lost. I've carried regrets. But kindness, it's the thing I return to. Because it costs nothing, and it changes everything." The audience stirred. Quiet movement, like breath returning to a still room. Keanu turned back to Victor and added gently, "You don't have to pretend to be perfect to choose decency. You just have to care." Victor swallowed hard. His voice was almost inaudible when he said, "And what if people don't care back?" Keanu tilted his head. "Then you gave them something they weren't ready for. But you still gave them something good." The silence after that wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Keanu looked once more toward the crowd, who were watching him not as fans or viewers, but as people. Real people, moved, still, listening. He stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just calmly. And once upright, he reached for the microphone on his lapel, gently removing it. A stagehand rushed toward him, but he waved them off with a small nod. Then he turned back to the audience and said, "Before I go, I just want to leave you with one thing." He glanced around the room, eyes touching faces, not skimming past them. "When everything feels loud, when people are pushing and pulling, demanding you pick a side, raise your voice, throw the next stone, I hope you'll remember this." He paused, then finished with quiet clarity. "Let's choose dignity when it's hardest." The crowd rose as one. No hesitation, no prompting, just movement. As if the whole room had been holding back tears and breath and belief, and in that one line, something had been released. Applause filled the studio. Not the hollow kind reserved for punchlines or finale bows, but something fuller, heartfelt, relentless. Some people clapped with tears on their faces, others with hands over their chests. A few just stood still, head bowed, as if trying to absorb what had just been offered. Keanu didn't linger in the center of the stage. He stepped toward the wings, giving a small wave to the crowd, mouthing the words, "Thank you." A stagehand extended a hand. Keanu took it briefly, then disappeared into the shadows offstage. Victor Langston remained seated at his desk. He looked out at the audience, his hands folded tightly together now, the bravado long gone. He blinked twice, then sat back in his chair, saying nothing. The applause didn't fade quickly. It rose again as Keanu's final line echoed in people's minds. "Let's choose dignity when it's hardest." The band didn't play. The stage lights didn't flash. There was no catchy jingle, no credits, no flashy fade to commercial. Just reverence and silence. Even backstage, the mood had changed. The producers stopped whispering into headsets. The assistant director had taken off her headset and simply stood still by the control board, watching the monitors. On one screen, Keanu was shown walking alone down the side hallway toward the exit. No entourage, no flash. Just one man, walking in peace. In the sound booth, a young editor whispered to her colleague, "We just filmed history." Her colleague nodded. And it didn't come from the questions. It came from the answers. Social media, still buzzing, exploded with a new wave of clips. The final moment, the line about dignity, was clipped within seconds by a fan watching the live stream overseas. The caption read, "This is more than a quote, this is a way to live." Within minutes, it was retweeted by major celebrities, pastors, authors, activists. A best-selling novelist wrote, "If you're raising a son, show him this moment. If you're building a company, model it after this." Another post read, "Hell didn't slam the door. He opened a new one." Back on set, Victor still hadn't moved. A floor manager approached him cautiously. "Do you want to wrap it up?" Victor nodded slowly, stood and turned to the camera. But for once, he didn't say anything. The screen faded to black on his silence. And somewhere down the hall, Keanu stepped outside into the night air, lifted his face toward the sky, and let the quiet wrap around him. He had said what he came to say, and left exactly when he was supposed to. As Keanu walked slowly toward the backstage hallway, a production assistant hurried beside him, wide-eyed and breathless. "Mr. Reeves, thank you. People are crying out there. I've worked this show 3 years. I've never seen anything like that." Keanu gave her a warm nod. "Neither have I." She hesitated, then added, "I think you changed something tonight." Keanu didn't reply right away. He glanced back at the stage. The applause had died down, but the atmosphere still hummed with something electric. Not excitement, something quieter. Like a ripple passing through hearts, not ears. "He just tried to stay honest," he said. The assistant looked down. Sometimes that's the hardest thing in the world. Outside the studio, fans were already gathering beyond the security gates. Not to scream, not to shove phones in his face. They were holding up handwritten signs. "Kindness isn't weakness. Let's choose dignity when it's hardest. Thank you for showing us how." Keanu took a few steps closer to the edge of the lot. He didn't wave for cameras. He didn't call attention to himself. He simply smiled at the crowd. Quiet, grateful, and placed one hand over his heart. A woman in the crowd wiped tears from her eyes. A teenager raised his phone not to record but to text, "This guy just changed my life." Somewhere far behind them, inside the studio, the floor lights powered down. The desk sat empty. The show was over. But something else was just beginning. Not a scandal, not a viral moment, a movement. And Keanu Reeves had walked into it, not with noise or strategy, but with something far rarer. Grace. Victor Langston burst through the backstage doors, his microphone still clipped to his collar, his face pale with a mix of disbelief and frustration. He tugged the earpiece from his ear and tossed it on a table, then paced the hallway, avoiding eye contact with the crew scrambling around him. No one said anything. No one dared. The air backstage was thick, part confusion, part fear. Victor's long-standing dominance as host of one of the most popular late-night shows had rarely been questioned, but tonight, something had shifted, and everyone had felt it. A junior producer approached slowly. "Victor," she said quietly, "the control room wants to know if you want to record a post-show recap." "No," he snapped, "there's nothing to recap." She nodded quickly and backed away. Victor turned toward the monitors, still playing highlights of the episode. One showed Keanu standing as he spoke the final words of the night. "Let's choose dignity when it's hardest." Victor narrowed his eyes as if hoping the screen would change, but it didn't. It stayed on Keanu. Another assistant came rushing down the corridor, holding a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this." Victor waved him off. "No, really. It's exploding. The headlines are already up, all of them." Victor snatched the tablet. The screen lit up with news alerts and social media threads. Keanu wins the night with quiet strength. Victor Langston slammed for personal attack on Reeves. Late night cruelty meets its match. We stand with Keanu trending across the globe. His face tightened as he scrolled. Even the sponsors were reacting. One brand's official Twitter page had already posted, "We believe in empathy, grace, and respect. We stand with kindness." They didn't mention Victor's name, but they didn't need to. He handed the tablet back with a grunt and stormed off toward his dressing room. Behind him, a camera tech whispered, "He's never looked that shaken." Inside his dressing room, Victor shut the door hard and leaned against it. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stared into the mirror. What stared back wasn't the polished host he had spent years curating. It was someone exposed, outplayed, and undone by nothing but silence and restraint. As Victor sat alone, his staff began receiving messages from past guests. One email subject line read, "Glad someone finally stood up to him." A well-known actress tweeted, "Victor made me cry in the green room 3 years ago. I wasn't the only one. What Keanu did tonight, he did for all of us." A musician added, "I've avoided that show for a reason, but tonight, I watched every second, and I felt healed." More guests chimed in. Anonymous Reddit threads popped up, recounting backstage stories of insults disguised as jokes, of interviews cut to embarrass, of moments that haunted careers for months afterward. The flood was beginning, and at the center of it all was a man who hadn't raised his voice once. Keanu Reeves, meanwhile, was already home. He had slipped away quietly after the taping. No red carpet, no statements, no celebration. Just a quiet car ride through city streets, headlights reflecting off his windshield as he sat in stillness. His phone buzzed constantly in his pocket. He didn't check it. He placed it face down on the counter untouched. Instead, he filled the kettle. The soft hiss of boiling water broke the silence in his kitchen. He moved slowly, methodically, not like a man escaping the storm, but like someone who had already made peace with the weather. He poured the water into his mug and dropped in a bag of chamomile tea. Deem rose, his shoulders dropped. He stood for a long moment, watching it steep. Then he walked to the window, tea in hand, and looked out into the dark. There were no lights flashing, no reporters. Just night, just peace, and it was enough. Across the world, as posts continued to circulate and headlines refreshed by the minute, Keanu sat in stillness. He didn't need to speak again. He had said what mattered, and now the world was answering back. Not with outrage, but with reverence. The fallout had begun, and for once, it was falling in the right direction. Back at the network headquarters, the executive team was already in a late-night emergency meeting. The head of PR had her phone plugged into a portable charger as she scrolled through real-time analytics. "We've never seen this level of sentiment shift in under an hour," she said. "The audience isn't just angry, they're disappointed." A marketing lead chimed in. "It's not like when a guest gets offended and moves on. This was surgical." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't attack. He just told the truth. And now we look like we set him up. The showrunner leaned back, rubbing his forehead. And Victor made it worse every time he doubled down. One of the interns, bold and new enough to still speak freely, added, "Keanu made him irrelevant without lifting a finger." Nobody disagreed. The network's ad partners had already started pulling scheduled campaign spots for the following week's show. One of the biggest streaming services had sent a message that simply read, "Our values must align with the talent we support." Internally, the phrase contingency plan started circulating. Meanwhile, Keanu remained unplugged from all of it. He walked through his living room, picked up a book from a stack by the fireplace, and sat down in a worn leather chair. He didn't open the book. Not yet. He just sat with the quiet, letting the storm outside pass by like a distant train. Inside his mind there was no self-congratulation, no pride, just relief that he had kept his promise to himself, to not retaliate, to not play their game, to stay kind. Especially when it was hardest. Far from the cameras and commentary, Keanu looked out through the window at the stillness of the night. A soft wind moved the trees beyond the glass. He took another sip of tea and closed his eyes for a moment. Peace wasn't something that came from applause or headlines. It came from knowing who you are and choosing to remain that person when it matters most. Tonight, he had done just that. And in doing so, he had reminded the world that even in a culture of noise, silence, with dignity, can still be heard louder than anything else. By dawn, the internet wasn't just reacting to Keanu Reeves, it was reverberating with him. News platforms across the globe ran the same core message. The headlines varied, but the spirit was identical. Keanu ends interview with grace, not rage. Victor crosses the line. Keanu stands taller. Kindness isn't a tactic, it's strength. Clips from the interview dominated feeds. The phrase, "Let's choose dignity when it's hardest," was quoted by celebrities, faith leaders, teachers, and journalists alike. Someone even added it to the list of trending quotes on Goodreads. On TikTok, thousands of creators lip-synced Keanu's lines, overlaying their own experiences of staying calm in the face of cruelty. What had started as a late-night segment was quickly becoming a global conversation. Influencers began weaving Keanu's interview into their content, some drawing parallels to online bullying, others using it as a model for emotional intelligence. Mental health coaches posted breakdowns of Keanu's breathing, his stillness, his refusal to escalate. They labeled it real-time emotional regulation and a masterclass in boundary setting. But the most surprising response came from schools. In a small classroom in Ohio, a high school teacher had abandoned her usual curriculum. She showed the full clip of Keanu calmly standing up to Victor's final jab. Then she turned off the screen and simply asked, "What did you see?" One student, a quiet boy in the back, raised his hand slowly and said, "He didn't yell, he didn't even look mad, but somehow it was the strongest thing I've ever seen." Another said, "He didn't just talk about being kind, he proved it's stronger than anger." Their teacher smiled and nodded. Exactly. He didn't need to fight to win. He held his values. That moment, captured in a short video and posted online, went viral. It was shared by parents, educators, and celebrities, all echoing the same realization. Keanu's silence spoke louder than Victor's platform ever had. As the video continued to spread, the real-world impact deepened. A university in Seattle offered an impromptu lecture titled "Silence, Power, and Public Integrity: What We Learned from Keanu Reeves." Within 2 hours, the auditorium was full. A professor of ethics walked students through Keanu's choice to avoid personal retaliation, labeling it grace-based resistance. At the end of the lecture, a student stood and said, "We're always taught that you have to speak louder to be heard. But he just showed us the opposite." Elsewhere, therapy offices displayed posters with quotes from the interview. One poster had the line, "Kindness isn't a tactic, It's how I survive," beneath a soft photo of Keanu's still expression during the interview. A trauma counselor explained on a podcast, "When people witness grace under pressure, it rewires how they believe they can respond to stress." In coffee shops and living rooms, people talked about it, not because Keanu was famous, but because he had done something rare. He stayed human. And in contrast, Victor Langston was now facing the cost of years of deflection. Still rattled, Victor tried to shift the narrative. He appeared on a long-form podcast known for its no-filter format. Sitting under studio lights, trying to look relaxed, Victor opened with what he thought was charm. "Look, it's comedy. If we can't poke at each other anymore, what are we even doing?" The host gave him room to speak, but the audience online was already reacting. Clips from the podcast spread almost as fast as the original interview. Victor said, "People are acting like I insulted a saint. He's an actor. He knew what he was walking into." But the public wasn't buying it. The contrast was too fresh, too visible. They had seen the moment. They had seen the grace. And Victor's excuses fell flat. One tweet summed it up. He still thinks it was about getting the last word. He doesn't get that Keanu didn't want the last word. He wanted the right one. By midweek, the conversation had shifted from viral sensation to cultural reflection. An editorial in a major newspaper read, "We needed this, not a perfect man, but a decent one. Not a flawless performance, but a reminder that strength and stillness can coexist." Public figures added their voices. A former president reposted the classroom clip, capturing it, "When character meets a microphone, you get this." A Grammy-winning artist reshared Keanu's closing line with the words, "A quiet revolution starts right here." Meanwhile, in houses of worship, spiritual leaders wove the moment into sermons. One pastor in Atlanta said, "What Keanu did on that stage isn't about celebrity, it's about character. He was tempted to fight, but chose to stand." The result wasn't just praise, it was movement. Counselors began citing the interview in resilience training. Parents used it as an example for teaching their kids self-control. A guidance counselor in Arizona posted, "For once, we get to point to something public and say, 'This is who you can be.'" Keanu said nothing. He didn't do a follow-up interview. He'll clarify his position. He didn't double down. He let the moment breathe. And that silence became its own answer. Back on social media, the hashtags kept trending, but one began to rise above the rest. Live like Keanu. It wasn't meant to idolize him. It wasn't about worship. It was about remembering that someone had faced disrespect and responded with grace. Victor, on the other hand, had gone quiet again. His next show aired, but it opened to the lowest ratings in years. Sponsors didn't renew. One guest pulled out hours before taping, and online the sentiment remained cold. One clip from the interview kept resurfacing. The moment Keanu gently said, "I'm not perfect, I'm human, that's why I choose to be kind." A teacher reposted it with this caption, "I play this every morning before class. It reminds me how to begin again." Keanu hadn't set out to start a movement. He had just stayed true to himself. And the world, hungry for something real, had responded. The shift didn't happen overnight, but it started the next morning. Producers across Hollywood gathered in urgent, unplanned meetings, not because they were told to, but because they knew what they had witnessed and what it meant. For years, late-night comedy had thrived on edge. Zingers, roast culture, tension disguised as banter. But Keanu Reeves had walked onto one of the most combative stages in television, and without raising his voice, he had changed the temperature of the room. And then, the world. Network executives began pulling analytics from the night of the interview. Ratings had spiked, yes, but the real shock came in the engagement metrics. Viewer sentiment, comment ratios, rewatch numbers, social media traction. It all pointed in the same direction. People didn't just tune in for drama. They stayed for dignity. One executive, overseeing a major late-night franchise, held a staff-wide Zoom that morning. "We've got to stop pretending cruelty is charisma," he said. Keanu didn't just survive the segment, he transformed it, and the audience responded. The shift was subtle at first. Writers' rooms, once filled with punch-up teams, started slowing down their openers. Monologues became gentler. Hosts introduced guests with more care. Producers trimmed segments they might have kept in just months before. Anything that felt like it crossed into mockery. A respected host, known for quick sarcasm, opened his next show with a moment of stillness. "I watched the Keanu interview," he said, facing the audience, "and I realized something. I've made a career of laughing at things, but maybe it's time we start laughing with people, not at them." The audience responded with hesitant applause, then louder. He nodded, genuinely moved. "That man showed us something. And I want to try a different kind of show tonight." That night, he invited a nurse, a teacher, and a foster care advocate onto his stage. No jokes, just real stories. The episode had double the usual viewership by morning. It was clear, something had cracked open. Across studios and production companies, the ripple became a current. Streaming networks held brainstorming sessions around content with emotional weight. Words like grace, presence, and intentional tone appeared on whiteboards. Talent agents began suggesting their clients appear on shows where their humanity wouldn't be weaponized. And then, inevitably, the conversation turned toward Victor Langston. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, sponsors began to quietly withdraw. One beverage company released a vague public statement: "We support content that uplifts, informs, and connects." They didn't mention Victor's name. They didn't need to. Two major advertising partners pulled out by the end of the week. Viewers noticed. So did the press. An industry article on Deadline ran with the headline, "Talk Show Shock. Brands pull back from Langston following Keanu fallout." Internally, Victor's own team was divided. Some argued for a full apology. Others suggested he lie low. But no one had an answer to the question everyone avoided asking out loud: what if the audience doesn't come back? The next episode of The Victor Langston Show aired with noticeably less energy. Fewer audience members, more awkward pauses. Victor avoided the subject entirely, instead focusing on fluff interviews and comedy skits. But the damage was done. Clips of the prior week continued circulating online, especially the final moment when Keanu had said, "Let's choose dignity when it's hardest." A slow-burning headline began to dominate social media. The interview that ended an era. In contrast, other late-night shows flourished. One up-and-coming host, previously struggling with ratings, gained momentum with a new segment called The Quiet Chair, where guests were given 2 minutes to share something vulnerable without interruption. The first guest was a woman who had survived years of childhood abuse. She spoke softly, haltingly, about forgiveness. When she finished, the host simply said, "Thank you for trusting us." No jokes followed, just applause. Clips of that moment soared online. In comment sections, one phrase kept appearing: "Keanu taught us how to listen again." And audiences weren't just responding, they were returning. As the days turned into weeks, the entertainment world continued to evolve. Writers once hired solely for punchlines now collaborated with empathy coaches. Network meetings began opening with the question, is this content constructive? Panel shows pivoted toward thoughtful discussion, and even red carpet interviews started losing their snark. Behind the scenes, Victor Langston's name became harder to say out loud. Some studios referred to him only in legal briefings. One executive summarized the situation bluntly. The industry didn't cancel Victor, he canceled himself, and Keanu just held the mirror. By the third week, The Victor Langston Show was suspended indefinitely. The official reason was a creative pause. Internally, it was a collapse. Producers jumped ship, writers resigned, viewership plummeted. But no one was surprised. because the audience had already made its decision. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves remained silent. He didn't post a statement, didn't take a victory lap. When asked for interviews, he politely declined. When asked for brand deals, he turned them away. He stayed where he always had, just beyond the spotlight, but his presence remained everywhere. One headline from a major publication put it best: "The man who didn't raise his voice and changed the industry anyway." In film schools, his moment on Victor's stage was studied as a case in restraint, integrity, and influence without aggression. One professor concluded, "This is what it looks like when culture turns on a whisper, not a scream." Back in classrooms, students continued watching the clip. One middle school teacher shared that a quiet student had spoken up for the first time all year after seeing it. "He didn't even say much," the teacher recalled. "Just, that guy made it okay to be kind." That was the legacy forming now, not just around Keanu's name, but around the choices he made when the lights were brightest. Late-night television would never be the same, and no one, not hosts, not networks, not viewers, could say they hadn't been changed by the moment when one man met cruelty with calm and transformed an entire medium. In the weeks that followed, Keanu Reeves didn't speak a single public word about what had happened on the Victor Langston show. Not to a reporter, not through a press agent, not even on social media. There were no statements, no interviews, no retweets or likes. He didn't own the moment. He simply walked through it and let it pass. That silence became his answer. At first, the media tried to fill the vacuum. Is Keanu going to speak out? Will he respond to Victor's failed apology tour? But nothing came. His team released a gentle clarification to journalists. Keanu prefers not to comment at this time. He appreciates the support. And that was it. For most celebrities, silence is a branding tactic, a pause before the next headline. But this was different. Keanu wasn't retreating. He was choosing stillness. He returned to his usual rhythms: morning motorcycle rides through the hills, late dinners at quiet spots in Los Feliz, weekend visits to the same bookstore he's been going to for over a decade. He waved at fans, signed autographs when asked, and declined every media request without a hint of annoyance. Still, the world spoke for him. A clip resurfaced from an old film set where Keanu once waited in the rain with a stagehand whose car had broken down. They had stood in silence for nearly 2 hours, just waiting for the tow truck to arrive. Keanu never mentioned it. The crew member shared the story years later, saying, "He didn't leave, he didn't check his phone, he just stayed. Like it was the most natural thing in the world to be kind." That story, reposted in the aftermath of the Victor incident, went viral again. And this time it landed deeper, because people now understood what Keanu showed on that stage wasn't a moment. It was a pattern, a lifetime of calm decisions, grace under pressure, stillness without retreat, and above all, silence when others shouted. The silence itself became louder than any press tour ever could. On Instagram, fans began sharing Keanu's words from the interview in white text over dark backgrounds. "I'm not perfect. I'm human. That's why I choose to be kind." The posts spread with a quiet urgency, reposted not by influencers alone, but by therapists, teachers, and parents. One elementary school in Portland turned the quote into a hallway mural. Students painted handprints around the phrase, each color representing a different act of kindness they'd committed during the week. In churches and mosques, the clip of Keanu speaking softly about grief isn't weakness, it's proof of love, was replayed as part of sermons on compassion and endurance. A pastor in Georgia called it one of the most Christ-like public moments I've seen in years. A high school debate coach printed Keanu's full response to Victor's "too nice" insult and passed it out to his team. Underlined in red was the sentence, "Kindness isn't a tactic, it's how I survive." "Read this," he told them. "This is how you win without gloating. Meanwhile, a well-known film director who had worked with Keanu a decade earlier wrote a heartfelt thread that took social media by storm. He shared, "During a particularly difficult shoot, one of our lighting crew got a phone call that his wife had gone into early labor. He was panicked. She was 2 states away. Before anyone else could respond, Keanu had already pulled out his wallet and booked the man a same-day flight. No announcement, no cameras. He even called a car himself and stood with the man until it arrived." The post ended with, "Keanu didn't change on that stage. He revealed who he's always been." The reaction was overwhelming. Thousands of people replied with their own stories. A cafe worker who said Keanu tipped $100, 0 cents, and washed his own table. A bookstore clerk who remembered him recommending a book about healing from trauma and buying the same copy for 5 other customers waiting behind him. None of it had ever gone viral before. But now, in his silence, the world was remembering and choosing to speak on his behalf. A phrase began to spread quietly across digital spaces and community boards. "Choose strength with grace." It wasn't a slogan, it wasn't merchandised, it wasn't officially linked to Keanu in any way, but everyone knew where it came from. It appeared at the bottom of email signatures, on whiteboards in therapy offices, typed at the end of Instagram captions, stitched into bracelets on Etsy, even whispered in the halls of middle schools when conflicts started to flare. It became the movement Keanu never intended to start, but had sparked all the same. One post on Reddit captured it perfectly. "This isn't about standing a celebrity. It's about remembering that it's possible to be powerful without being cruel." Meanwhile, Victor Langston's name slowly faded from the trending charts. He tried another podcast appearance, hoping to explain his side, but even sympathetic hosts struggled to help him. The more he talked, the smaller the audience became, because the world had made up its mind, and it wasn't about scandal anymore. It was about aspiration. Keanu had walked into a hostile space, said only what mattered, and walked away without bitterness. He hadn't tried to destroy anyone. He had only protected what he valued: dignity, humility, compassion. He didn't scream. He didn't insult. He didn't perform. He simply lived his truth, and the world followed. In classrooms, offices, shelters, homes, and hospitals, people invoked his words in moments when they might have chosen anger. In that space, they found another way, a softer one, a stronger one. They were not following a celebrity. They were following a principle. And Keanu? He stayed silent through it all, not out of pride, not out of fear, but out of peace. He didn't need to speak again, because the moment had already spoken for him, and its echo was still growing. In the months that followed Keanu Reeves's quiet confrontation on national television, something remarkable happened. The moment didn't fade, but deepened. At first, it was a wave of social commentary, essays, and social media posts. But slowly, it became something else entirely, something more lasting, something cultural. Professors began integrating the interview into their syllabi. At Princeton, a leadership ethics course opened with Keanu's quote, "We can't control what people throw at us, but we can control what we throw back." Students watched the interview not to study performance, but presence. One professor titled the week's lecture, "The High Road Isn't Empty, It's Powerful." At Columbia Business School, an organizational leadership class broke into small groups to discuss how Keanu handled confrontation in real time. They noted the shift in his tone, his posture, the way he never lost eye contact, yet never turned hostile. A student wrote in her journal that week, "I always thought power meant domination, but I think I finally understand power can also be calm, still, centered." At UCLA's School of Film and Television, a screenwriting course used the clip to demonstrate the difference between reactive dialogue and narrative intention. What Keanu did, one instructor said, was a full character arc in 10 sentences. Meanwhile, activists and community organizations began citing the moment in workshops. One group in Baltimore called Voices Without Violence played the segment for teens navigating conflict in high-risk schools. The facilitator paused after Keanu's line, "Kindness isn't a tactic, it's how I survive," and asked them, "What does survival look like when you're protecting peace, not pride?" A boy in the back of the room whispered, "It looks like strength no one can take from you." That answer stayed with the group. They turned it into a mural the next week, painting those words alongside a quiet portrait of Keanu's expression from that night. The moment had moved beyond entertainment. It had become a blueprint. Professional spaces took note too. At a leadership retreat for Fortune 100 executives, Keanu's interview was shown alongside a case study titled "Disarm with Dignity." Participants were asked to analyze not only what he said, but what he withheld. One CEO remarked, "I realized I've built an entire management style on control. But what if the most powerful thing I could do is listen and wait?" The workshop ended with every leader writing down one behavior they would let go of and one they would replace it with. On the board at the front of the room, someone wrote in bold marker, "I will stop interrupting. I will start listening to understand." The group applauded. Meanwhile, law enforcement training programs in several U.S. cities quietly adopted a de-escalation unit centered on the interview. A tactical response instructor in Phoenix said, "We teach defensive posture." But Keanu modeled something better: responsive posture. Still but alert, soft-spoken but firm. That's harder. That's real control. Public speakers, authors, and therapists all followed suit. TEDx organizers hosted a panel titled "Grace Under Pressure: Learning from Still Voices." One speaker opened her talk by saying, "Sometimes the loudest voice isn't the one shouting. It's the one holding its ground without raising its volume." In one university library in Ontario, a quote from Keanu appeared on the walls above the study tables. "The way we treat others is the legacy we leave." That quote was also printed on bookmarks and handed out to incoming freshmen during orientation. A student posted a picture of hers on Twitter with the caption, "If this is how we're starting the school year, I'm hopeful." In hospitals and recovery centers, the clip was played during group therapy. One counselor explained, "Keanu's message resonated with trauma survivors. His steady tone gave people permission to stay grounded, even when they've been hurt." The movement was slow, quiet, but everywhere. People weren't just quoting Keanu, they were applying what he embodied. He hadn't just made a point, he'd set a new standard. And soon, that standard would be recognized. The invitation came unexpectedly. A letter, handwritten, from the committee of a small but deeply respected humanitarian organization in New York. They wanted to honor Keanu with their annual award for public dignity and compassion in action. Past recipients included aid workers, teachers, and civil rights volunteers. It was not a star-studded event. There would be no red carpet, no flashing cameras. Just a gathering of people who believed dignity could change the world. Keanu hesitated. He didn't feel he deserved it. But after a quiet conversation with a friend who worked in community health, he agreed. The night of the event was rainy and unassuming. Guests arrived carrying umbrellas, dressed modestly, their applause warm but gentle. When Keanu entered, the room stood. Not in the way people stand for celebrities, but in the way people stand for someone who's helped them see the world more clearly. When the presenter introduced him, they said only this: "Showed us how to remain human when being human wasn't easy." He didn't break the system. He just reminded us we don't have to become it. Keanu walked to the microphone, looked out at the quiet audience, and spoke without notes. "I'm honored," he began softly, "but I don't feel like I did anything extraordinary." He paused, letting that truth settle. "I just didn't want to forget who I was." Another pause. "We're all going to be tested. People will come at us with noise, with mockery, with judgment. That's not what matters. What matters is who we remain, when no one's watching, or when everyone is. He looked up. The way we treat others is the legacy we leave. The room held its breath. Then, slowly, applause filled the space. Not roaring, but steady, lasting. Afterward, Keanu stepped outside alone. He stood in the drizzle, hands in his pockets, looking out over the quiet street. He hadn't planned to change anything. He just held the line, and somehow, that became a legacy the world had already begun carrying forward. The announcement came not with fireworks, but with silence. In the early afternoon, the network quietly updated its website with a short statement. After 15 years of programming, The Victor Langston Show has ended its run. We are grateful to the team and wish them continued success in their future endeavors. No tribute montage, no farewell episode, no public comment from Victor. For a show that once thrived on volume, its end came like the closing of a door in a quiet hallway. Behind the scenes, executives had debated the decision for weeks. Advertising partners had dropped off steadily. Viewer engagement had plummeted. Internal surveys showed audiences didn't just lose interest, they no longer trusted the format. Victor had tried to recover: a rebrand, a new stage design, a short-lived podcast spin-off. But it was clear, the public wasn't just rejecting the man, they were rejecting the model. It wasn't revenge, it was redirection. And in the void that followed, something unexpected bloomed. A new program appeared on the late-night schedule just 1 month later. It was titled The Thread. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. No monologue, no viral bait. Just meaningful, human conversation. Each episode opened with a letter, written by the guest to someone who had shaped their life. Sometimes it was joyful, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes just honest. The host sat beside them in a circle of light, separated by no desk, no applause signs, just stillness. Guests included musicians, authors, survivors, single parents, educators, veterans, and asterisk teens. Stories flowed freely, and vulnerability became the anchor. Clips from The Thread gained traction online. One segment featured a Broadway actor sharing how his high school teacher saved him from dropping out. Another showed a former athlete reflecting on failure and forgiveness. None of it was sensational, but every word mattered. Viewers responded with gratitude, not just because the content had changed, but because it felt like the people had been heard. The world hadn't wanted blood. They had wanted truth. And without Keanu Reeves ever returning to a single stage, his legacy quietly set a new standard. As The Thread found its audience, other shows began paying attention. Producers once known for engineering gotcha moments pivoted toward connection. One network talk show removed its celebrity roast segment entirely, replacing it with a recurring spotlight on community heroes. Instead of tearing people down, they lifted people up. The audience numbers didn't drop. In fact, they rose. Late-night writers' rooms adjusted their tone. Instead of mining interviews for out-of-context clips, they began scripting space for deeper conversation. Hosts known for sarcasm shifted their posture, physically leaning in, emotionally leaning back. In one interview, a best-selling author appeared on a popular comedy show. When asked why she agreed to come on despite years of avoidance, she smiled. "Because I watched how you treated your last guest. I saw something change in you, and I knew Keanu had something to do with it." The audience erupted in applause. Meanwhile, Keanu stayed silent. He didn't claim credit, he didn't post reflections. When asked about it in passing by journalists, he offered a quiet shake of his head and changed the subject. Yet his impact remained undeniable. Industry panels hosted discussions about how late-night formats were evolving. Media experts wrote think pieces titled "The Kindness Pivot" and "The Reeves Effect." Even rival hosts, men and women who had once mirrored Victor's style, began publicly acknowledging the shift. One of them, known for aggressive satire, opened a monologue with an unusual admission. "We've been confusing cruelty with courage," he said. But then Keanu reminded us what real strength looks like. "So, I'm going to try something harder. I'm going to be real." That segment trended for days, not because it was funny, but because it was human. Behind the scenes, young writers in Hollywood were pitching shows built not around shock, but sincerity. A producer at a major network greenlit a new series framed around intergenerational dialogue, grandparents and grandchildren sharing their stories. The pitch was simple: because kindness never goes out of style. The idea passed in 5 minutes. The culture had changed. And while no one said it aloud during production meetings, everyone knew the same thing. It had started with Keanu. As the entertainment world continued recalibrating, viewers noticed something strange. They weren't watching less. They were watching differently. Instead of turning to television for noise, they began turning to it for reflection. The question shifted from, "What did they say?" to, "How did that make me feel?" In fan communities online, a recurring phrase kept appearing beneath clips of these newer, softer segments. Helm didn't destroy Victor, he transformed the moment. One young fan posted a TikTok showing a side-by-side of Victor's last episode and a recent episode of The Thread. Her caption read, "Different decade, different tone, same slot." And all because one man stayed calm when it counted. The reply comment under the post read, "We grew up watching conflict. Now we're growing up with care." Even comedy began evolving. Writers started embracing self-deprecating humor and collaborative improv over cruelty. At a comedy festival in Austin, a panel called "Laughing Without the Knife" packed the house. Stand-up veterans discussed how punchlines could land just as hard when they came from shared experience rather than division. One comedian said, "Keanu didn't kill comedy, he just gave it a conscience." Meanwhile, back at his home, Keanu continued living as he always had. He worked on a quiet indie project set in a small town. He volunteered anonymously at a shelter twice a month. He still rode the same motorcycle, still carried the same canvas bag with a paperback stuffed inside. He had never asked to lead a cultural shift. He just lived his values in a room full of noise and didn't flinch. The industry kept evolving around him. Studios added new mentorship programs centered on emotional intelligence. Communication firms introduced Keanu's interview as a module in their corporate training decks. And when award season rolled around, The Thread was nominated not for its cinematography or writing, but for excellence in social impact. The host, when accepting the honor, said simply, "This show wouldn't exist if someone hadn't shown us a better way." No one needed to ask who they met, because they all knew. He didn't shout. He didn't retaliate. He just stood up, and in doing so lifted everything. The morning sun was still low when Keanu Reeves stepped quietly into the park near his home. There were no cameras, no security, just the sound of leaves moving in the wind, birds rustling in the branches above, and the steady rhythm of his footsteps on the path. Wearing a dark hoodie and simple jeans, Keanu looked like any other passerby out for a morning walk. No one bothered him. A few people recognized him, but no one approached, at least not at first. Then, as he rounded a quiet bend in the trail, he noticed an older man sitting alone on a bench. His cane leaned against the armrest, and he was squinting into the distance, lost in thought. Keanu slowed, glanced down, then quietly took a seat beside him. They didn't speak for a few moments, just sat in silence. Then the man turned, surprised but calm. "You're him, aren't you?" Keanu nodded once and smiled. "Sometimes." The old man chuckled. "You handled yourself real good that night. On that talk show. My granddaughter made me watch it twice." Keanu looked down at the path, hands folded. "I didn't try to handle anything," he said. "I just didn't want to become what I was standing in front of." The man nodded, deeply. That's what she said. My granddaughter, she said, he didn't clap back. He didn't shut him down. He just held his space. Never heard her talk like that before. They both sat quietly again. Then the old man smiled. You gave her something, made her think differently. Keanu looked over, then nodded. If that's all that happened, he said, it was enough. A few minutes later, they parted ways. No photos, no handshakes. Just two men crossing paths on a quiet morning, one of them unknowingly becoming a symbol of something greater. Elsewhere, the ripple kept growing. That same day, a young fan spotted Keanu outside a bookstore and hesitated before approaching. She didn't want an autograph. Just a moment, a real one. Keanu stopped walking, turned to face her, and said, "Hi." Nothing more. He smiled, thanked him for everything, and said, "I used to think you were just another celebrity, but you made me believe in stillness." Keanu smiled. "It's not always easy," he said, "but it's always worth it." Later that afternoon, Keanu visited the set of an upcoming indie film he was producing quietly, far away from the noise of mainstream media. The location was simple, a public square, filled with extras, parents, children, and local volunteers. During a break between scenes, he sat at a picnic table with two young actors, brothers, both under the age of 12. They had been shy all day, whispering between takes and staring wide-eyed at him from a distance. Finally, one of them asked, "Are you the guy from the internet? The one who didn't yell back?" Keanu smiled gently. "I guess I am." The younger one tilted his head. "Were you scared?" Keanu paused for a second. "Yeah," he said. "A little. But being scared doesn't mean you can't still choose how you respond." The older boy nodded slowly, thinking it over. "That's kind of cool," he said. "I want to be like that." Keanu reached over and lightly tapped his chest. "You already can. Starts right here." A few feet away, someone caught the exchange on a phone camera, not with a zoom lens or a tabloid setup, but with a simple swipe of a phone held respectfully low. That clip would later be uploaded without music, without titles, just titled "Keanu on Set," and it would go on to inspire millions once again. The thing that struck viewers wasn't what Keanu said. It was how he listened, how he responded without performing, how even in silence he carried a calm that made people want to follow, not out of fanfare, but out of trust. As the day wrapped, Keanu stayed late to help clean up, stacking folding chairs, collecting trash, and thanking each crew member personally. He didn't do it for attention, he did it because it mattered. Because kindness, to him, had never been an act. It had always been the foundation. And that's how it ends. Not with applause, not with headlines, but with a quiet walk through a park, a bench conversation with a stranger, a simple moment shared with a child. Because in the end, it wasn't the confrontation that changed the world. It was the grace with which it was met. Kindness isn't weakness. It's the hardest form of strength. And now, two final questions for you. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up with grace instead of anger? Tell us in the comments. What story should we tell next about Keanu Reeves? We'd love your suggestions.